Okay, today's study today is on 4.4, which is cellular respiration, which is where your body converts glucose into ATP using oxygen. The first thing that needs to happen is that the glucose needs to be split in half because it's too big to fit into the mitochondria. So we do this process called glycolysis. So glyco means glucose and lysis means to cut. It's an anaerobic process. It does not require oxygen. So anaerobic means does not need oxygen. It happens in the cytoplasm of the cell, so outside of the mitochondria. And because it doesn't need a mitochondrion, then glycolysis happens for every cell on Earth that is alive. So, for example, prokaryotes who do not have a mitochondrion still do glycolysis because they have the necessary proteins in the cytoplasm. Okay, and so what happens in glycolysis is it splits glucose, which I know we always do it with 6 sides. But as you know, the glucose molecule has 6 carbons, so we split this 6 carbon molecule into 2 3 carbon molecules that now can fit into the mitochondrion. In the process of splitting this glucose, which has quite a bit of energy in the bonds between the carbons, we produce 2 ATP. So we change to ADP. Remember that cycle of ATP to ADP and back again? We're on the back side of that cycle. So this process of glycolysis, splitting glucose into 2 3 carbon molecules, creates 2 ATP from 2 ADP. All right. Now, cellular respiration, which is what we call this process of changing your glucose into ATP, requires oxygen. And this is why you have to breathe. If you don't breathe, then your cell cannot regenerate its ATP to the level that's really important. And as a result, that cell is going to die. So that's why we all use oxygen right now. Aerobic stages take place in the mitochondrion. So remember, glycolysis is outside the mitochondrion and it's anaerobic, and the aerobic stages are inside the mitochondrion, require oxygen. The mitochondrion, as you remember, is an organelle found in both animal and plant cells. Now here's an example. You've heard of aerobic before, I think. So aerobic exercise means you're using oxygen pretty efficiently so that your muscles don't overtire. You're going just fast enough to require oxygen, but not too fast that you are over reaching your oxygen and run out of breath. Okay, so you're breathing hard and you're working your cardiovascular system well. Aerobic, therefore, is a fancy word for uses oxygen. So as you recall back here, cellular respiration requires oxygen, and we'll talk about why that is. All right, let's talk about the mitochondrion, which we have over here. You can see there's an outer membrane. This is one of those organelles that have a double membrane. So here's the outer membrane that this blue arrow is pointing to. Here's the inner membrane, and normally it's highly folded, but for the purposes of this picture we made it a little less folded, but it is very highly folded and is studded with tons of proteins that accomplish what's needed to do cellular respiration. There's the inner center of inside the inner membrane called the matrix. Yeah, just like the movie. So matrix means an interconnected framework, and that's what the matrix of your mitochondrion is. It's an interconnected network that you find inside the inner membrane. Then finally, there's the space here between the inner and the outer membrane. And this space is used, a lot of these transmembrane proteins that are on the inner membrane will be used to pump hydrogen ions into this intra membrane space to do some work for your body and turn things into ATP. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the electron transport chain and how these proteins do this kind of work, but as you recall, a protein that is for active transport will push against the concentration gradient. So we get a ton of those little ions up here in this intramembrane space, and then they can do work for your cell. Okay, the Krebs cycle, so that's a series of reactions that transfer energy to that electron transport chain that we just talked about. The Krebs cycle happens right here in the matrix. Remember, the matrix is the space inside the inner membrane. I know it looks like the arrows go across the membrane, but in fact, the matrix is inside the inner membrane, okay? It breaks down those 3 carbon molecules that we got from glycolysis. They come into the Krebs cycle. They go through this series of reactions that happen in the Krebs cycle, and the product is carbon dioxide. It also makes a little bit of ATP. All right. And it makes some energy-carrying molecules similar to the ones we had in photosynthesis. And for those of you who like advanced information, these energy-carrying molecules are NADH and FADH2, very close to some of the ones that we used over in photosynthesis. Okay, in the Krebs cycle, what's happening is that we're breaking the bonds between these carbon molecules. And of course, that energy that's released between those bonds ends up in these high energy molecules that I just talked about. So that's the first part of cellular respiration, happens in the matrix, the Krebs cycle. 2, 3 carbon molecules come in, we break those bonds, put the energy from those bonds into these high energy carriers, NADH and FADH2, and the product is CO2. This is what's left of the 6 carbon that went in, and that has absolutely no energy left in it, or almost none. Okay? The next part is the electron transport chain, which takes the energy carriers from glycolysis. As you recall, that's FADH2 and NADH. And these high energy molecule carriers that come from the Krebs cycle now go to this series of proteins, which we do not show in this picture, that are studded in the inner membrane. And this is called the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain, therefore, happens on the inner membrane. Electron transport chain happens on the inner membrane. And it requires oxygen to finish the process that the electron transport chain does, which is extremely efficient and makes almost all the ATP from the electron transport chain that comes out of breaking down glucose. So you get up to 36 ATP by the time we're done. You get like 2 or 4 or 6 like that, something like that from the Krebs cycle. You get 2 from glycolysis, and the rest you get over here. Plus, you give off water. The overall equation is you start with your glucose molecule and 6 oxygen, and it turns into 6 CO2 and 6 H2O. As you may recall, so here's your sugar going into your mitochondrion, getting broken down and releasing CO2, and then oxygen going in to the electron transport chain, creating ATP, and water comes off. Do you notice that this is the exact opposite of photosynthesis, where CO2 goes in? See, here's our CO2 that comes out. CO2 goes into the plant chloroplast, and with the light energy on the thylakoid membrane, it creates Boy, I'm saying this backwards. Let's go to water. Sorry, the water that comes off at the end of cellular respiration goes into the thylakoid with the light energy and creates those high energy molecules NADPH and ATP and gives off oxygen. And then in the Calvin cycle, which happens in the stroma, that's the liquid outside of the thylakoid and grana, takes in CO2 and fixes that carbon into glucose. So I hope you understand how these are opposite. Please come with questions tomorrow, and thank you for your attention.